The most dangerous person in a family is never the one screaming at the dinner table. It's the one sitting quietly at the center of it. I understood that too late. The Harrison dining room had always felt more like a courtroom than a place where people gathered to eat. The ceilings stretched nearly 20 feet high above us, crowned by an antique crystal chandelier that hummed softly whenever the heating pipes rattled through the walls. Rain pressed against the tall windows overlooking the east lawn, and the long oak table reflected the candlelight like dark water. Nobody spoke much during Harrison family dinners anymore, not since Isabel arrived. She stood beside David with a bottle of Cabernet in her hand, pouring wine with the calm precision of someone who already owned the house, even if her name wasn't on a single deed. Her blonde hair rested neatly against the cream silk of her dress, every movement controlled, elegant, impossible to criticize. David sat beside her in a charcoal suit that looked too tight around the shoulders. He kept adjusting his cufflinks every few seconds without realizing he was doing it. Across from them, Eleanor remained perfectly still beneath the chandelier, her pastel cardigan folded neatly over her lap as she stared at her untouched plate. She avoided looking at anyone directly, especially Isabel. Ethan leaned quietly against the staircase near the entrance hall, pretending to scroll through his phone while watching the entire room instead. Smart boy. He had started noticing the things the others refused to see. James moved silently between us, carrying silver serving trays, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the hardwood floors. Somewhere beyond the dining room, an old grandfather clock struck 9 times. Isabel finally smiled and lifted her wine glass slightly toward David. "Your father would have hated what this family has become," she said softly. The room went cold after that, not because of the words themselves, but because nobody challenged her. Not Victoria, not Eleanor, not even David. He simply lowered his eyes to the table like a child waiting for permission to breathe. That was the moment I realized. Something inside this house had shifted long before I understood it. Families don't fall apart all at once. They decay quietly, behind polite smiles, behind expensive dinners, behind people who know exactly how to make everyone else feel small without ever raising their voice. Isabel never needed to yell. She only needed silence. James reached the far end of the table and paused beside me for half a second longer than usual. His eyes flickered toward the hallway leading to the library. Then he whispered so quietly I almost thought I imagined it. "She was in there again last night." I looked toward the dark hallway just as the library door slowly clicked shut by itself. The library door remained closed for nearly 10 seconds after the sound echoed through the hallway. Nobody at the table reacted. That was what unsettled me most. Not the door itself. Not James warning me in a whisper. It was the silence that followed, the kind of silence people use when they have already agreed not to ask questions anymore. Isabel took another sip of wine and gently placed her glass beside David's plate. "Ethan," she said calmly without even turning toward him, "your grandmother asked you a question." Ethan looked up from his phone slowly. Eleanor had not spoken a single word all evening. The boy knew that as well as I did. But instead of correcting Isabel, he simply nodded once and walked toward the table. Smart again. He was learning survival inside this house. You survive by pretending her version of reality was the correct one. James returned to the kitchen carrying empty plates while thunder rolled softly outside the mansion. The storm had been building since late afternoon, turning the windows black long before sunset. Harrison Manor always felt heavier during rainstorms. The old stone walls trapped every sound, every footstep, every breath. I watched David loosen his tie slightly while Isabel rested one hand against the back of his chair. Possessive without appearing possessive. Everything about her worked that way. Nothing obvious. Nothing loud. Just enough pressure to make people forget who they used to be before she entered the room. Victoria finally spoke from the far end of the table. "The foundation board meets Friday morning," she said. "David will represent the family." David opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, then stopped when Isabel lightly touched his shoulder. "He will be ready," she answered for him. Eleanor lowered her eyes immediately after that. I noticed Ethan watching her from across the room. He noticed it too. Everyone in this family had started speaking through glances instead of words. The dinner ended quietly after dessert. Chairs slid back against hardwood floors. Candles burned low beside silver trays covered in fingerprints nobody bothered to wipe away. One by one, they disappeared upstairs, leaving the dining room hollow and dim beneath the chandelier. Isabel was the last to leave. She paused near the staircase and looked directly toward the dark hallway leading to the library. For the first time all evening, her calm expression shifted slightly. Not fear, more like irritation that something no longer felt fully under her control. Then she smiled again and followed David upstairs. 10 minutes later, I found James alone near the kitchen polishing crystal glasses that were already spotless. What was she doing in the library? I asked quietly. James stopped moving for a moment before answering. Looking for something Thomas hid before he died. The storm outside rattled the windows hard enough to shake the chandelier above us. And if she finds it? I asked. James looked toward the staircase carefully before lowering his voice. Then this family will belong to her completely. I did not sleep much that night. Rain continued tapping against the tall windows of the West Wing until nearly 3 in the morning. And somewhere deep inside the mansion, an old pipe kept groaning behind the walls every few minutes like the house itself was struggling to breathe. Harrison Manor had stood for almost 90 years on the cliffs overlooking the Hudson River, built by men who believed money could make a family permanent. They were wrong about that. Wealth only made the damage quieter. I woke before sunrise and found the downstairs already lit. Soft yellow lights spilled from beneath the library doors. Someone was inside. The hallway smelled faintly of old paper, fireplace ash, and the expensive cedar polish James used every Thursday morning. I stopped outside the door and listened carefully. No voices, only the slow sound of drawers opening and closing. Then silence. A few seconds later, the door opened unexpectedly, and Isabel stepped into the hallway wearing a cream cashmere sweater and dark slacks, perfectly composed despite the early hour. She barely looked surprised to see me standing there. "You are up early," she said with a small smile. "Old men do not sleep well during storms," I answered. Her eyes studied me for a second longer than necessary. Calm blue eyes. Empty eyes. The kind that never revealed where the real thoughts were hiding. "David has another difficult day ahead," she said softly. "The board has been pressuring him again." I nodded once. "And what were you doing in Thomas's library before sunrise?" For the first time, the smile on her face weakened slightly. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for me. "Looking for old tax records Victoria mentioned," she replied smoothly. "This family keeps too many secrets in filing cabinets." Then she walked past me toward the staircase without another word, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floors until the sound disappeared upstairs. I entered the library slowly after she left. Thomas had spent nearly 40 years inside that room handling the Harrison estate, and nothing in there had ever been out of place while he was alive. Now several drawers remained half open. Papers had been shifted. One leather chair near the fireplace sat slightly angled away from the desk, as though someone had searched behind it in a hurry. On the far wall, shelves stretched floor to ceiling beneath dim brass lighting. Family ledgers, trust agreements, property records, generations of controlled silence bound in dark leather. Ethan appeared quietly in the doorway holding a mug of coffee. "She has been coming in here for weeks," he said. I looked at him carefully. "How long have you known?" He leaned against the frame of the door and lowered his voice. "Long enough to realize everybody is pretending not to notice." Morning light slowly crept through the tall windows behind us, pale and cold against the dust floating through the room. Ethan stared toward Thomas's old desk for several seconds before speaking again. "Grandpa," he said quietly, "what if she is not looking for money?" I felt something tighten in my chest then, because deep down I already knew the answer. People like Isabel never cared about money first. They cared about control. By late afternoon, the storm had passed, but Harrison Manor still carried the heavy silent storms always left behind. The clouds outside hung low over the river, turning the windows gray and colorless. I spent most of the day in the library pretending to organize old financial records while Ethan sat across from me reading through board reports David had left behind weeks earlier. Neither of us said much. In houses like this, silence became its own language after enough years passed. Around 4 o'clock, the front doors opened downstairs and voices echoed through the marble entrance hall. Victoria had returned from the city. Even before I saw her, I recognized the sharp rhythm of her heels against the stone floors. Some people announced themselves without speaking. Victoria had perfected that years ago. Ethan quietly closed the folder in front of him the moment she entered the library. "There you are," Victoria said as she stepped inside without knocking. Her dark coat remained draped over one shoulder, rain still clinging to the fabric. At 58, she carried herself with the cold elegance of someone who had spent her entire life believing weakness was contagious. Her eyes moved immediately toward the desk drawers Isabel had searched earlier that morning. She noticed everything. "David called twice," she said toward me. Apparently, the foundation board meeting went poorly. I leaned back slowly in Thomas's old leather chair. That tends to happen when a man stops making his own decisions. Victoria's expression barely shifted. "You always blame the wrong people, Harrison." Ethan stood quietly near the bookshelf, pretending not to listen. Victoria glanced toward him for only a second before returning her attention to me. "Isabel has done more to stabilize this family than anyone else in this house," she said calmly. "Before she arrived, David was weak, directionless. The company was bleeding money." I looked toward the windows where pale sunlight struggled through the clouds. "And now?" I asked quietly. Now he cannot finish a sentence without looking at her first. For the first time, Victoria did not answer immediately. The grandfather clock near the fireplace ticked softly between us. 1 second, 2, 3. Then she walked toward Thomas's desk and rested her fingertips against the polished wood. "Control is not always cruelty," she said. "Sometimes people need someone stronger to guide them." Ethan looked up sharply after hearing that. Young people still believed manipulation had to sound ugly to be dangerous. They had not lived long enough to understand how gently it often arrived. Victoria finally turned toward the door again, but paused before leaving the room. "Thomas worried too much before he died," she said without looking back. "Old men mistake fear for wisdom." Then she disappeared into the hallway. Ethan waited until her footsteps faded upstairs before speaking. "She knows Isabel is searching this room," he whispered. I nodded slowly. The realization settled heavily inside my chest because suddenly everything felt clearer than before. Isabel was not moving through this family alone. Someone had opened the door for her years ago and taught her exactly where to stand once she entered. The following morning arrived strangely quiet. No rain, no wind, just thick gray fog hanging over the Hudson River beyond the cliffs behind Harrison Manor. The kind of morning where sound traveled too clearly through old houses. I heard cabinet doors opening downstairs before sunrise, coffee cups touching marble countertops, James moving carefully through the kitchen. Somewhere upstairs, David and Isabel arguing in low voices behind a closed door. Even muffled by walls, tension carried its own shape. I entered the dining room shortly after 7 and found Eleanor already sitting beneath the chandelier with both hands wrapped around a porcelain teacup. She looked exhausted. Her silver curls had not been brushed properly, and the soft pastel cardigan she always wore hung loosely from her shoulders as though she had lost weight overnight. She did not look up when I entered. "You should not stay in the library so long," she said quietly. "Thomas used to say this house listens when people spend too much time searching through old secrets." I poured myself coffee slowly before answering. "Then perhaps the house should stop hiding them." Eleanor finally lifted her eyes toward me. Tired blue eyes filled with the kind of fear people carry after protecting lies for too many years. "You think Isabel is the beginning of this family's problems," she whispered. "She is not." Before I could answer, the dining room doors opened, and Ethan walked in carrying several folders tucked beneath one arm. His expression looked sharper than usual, restless in a way young men become after discovering something they cannot ignore anymore. He placed the folders carefully onto the table beside me. "I checked the foundation reports from the past 3 years," he said quietly. "Money has been moving through shell charities connected to properties outside Connecticut and New York." Eleanor immediately lowered her eyes again. That reaction alone told me more than the documents did. Ethan opened one folder and slid a printed ledger toward me. Numbers highlighted in yellow stretched across the page beside signatures from multiple board meetings. David's signature appeared everywhere. Isabel's appeared nowhere. Smart. Invisible people survived longest in wealthy families. "Who approved these transfers?" I asked. Ethan hesitated briefly before answering. "Victoria chaired every meeting." Silence settled over the room after that. Heavy silence. The grandfather clock ticked steadily near the fireplace, while pale morning light spread slowly across the long oak table. Eleanor stared at the paperwork like she had seen it before. Maybe she had. Maybe everybody inside this mansion had been watching pieces of the truth for years while convincing themselves it was safer not to understand the full picture. Then James appeared quietly in the doorway holding a small brass key in one hand. "Mr. Harrison," he said carefully, "someone opened Thomas's private cabinet upstairs last night." My stomach tightened immediately because almost nobody knew that cabinet existed anymore. James stepped forward and placed the key beside my coffee cup. "There is only one thing stored inside," he said softly. "A letter Thomas wrote 3 days before he died." Thomas's private cabinet was hidden behind a row of law books nobody had touched in years. James led Ethan and me upstairs shortly after breakfast while the rest of the house remained quiet. Somewhere down the east hallway, I could hear Isabel speaking softly on the phone behind closed doors. Calm, controlled, like every morning inside Harrison Manor was perfectly ordinary. James stopped beside the bookshelf in Thomas's old study and pressed against a small brass latch concealed behind a leather-bound estate ledger. A narrow wooden panel clicked open slowly, revealing a steel lockbox hidden inside the wall. The air smelled faintly of dust and old cedar. "Thomas changed the hiding place twice before he passed," James whispered. "He said some people had become too interested in family records." Ethan looked toward me carefully. "Did he mean Isabel?" James hesitated for only a second. He never said her name directly. I inserted the brass key into the lockbox and turned it slowly until the mechanism released with a dull metallic sound. Inside sat a single cream-colored envelope addressed in Thomas's handwriting. My name. Nothing else. No dramatic warning. No legal markings. Just my name written carefully across the front like he already knew one day I would need to read whatever waited inside. I opened the envelope with steady hands while Ethan stood silently beside me. The letter inside contained only 2 pages. Thomas's handwriting looked shakier than I remembered, as though he had written it while exhausted. "Harrison, if you are reading this, then the situation inside the family has already gone further than I feared. Isabel is not dangerous because she lies. She is dangerous because she understands exactly what each member of this family needs emotionally, and she becomes that thing until they stop trusting themselves without her." I stopped reading for a moment after that. The room suddenly felt colder. Ethan remained motionless beside the desk while morning light stretched weakly across the carpet beneath us. I continued reading slowly. "Victoria believes Isabel can preserve the Harrison legacy through David. She does not understand that control eventually consumes the people who think they are directing it. Eleanor knows more than she admits. David knows less than he should. Be careful who you confront first. People protecting illusions rarely react well when those illusions begin collapsing." My eyes moved toward the final paragraph. "If Isabel gains permanent control over the foundation and estate voting structure, the family will become financially untouchable from the outside and emotionally dependent from the inside. At that point, removing her influence may no longer be possible without destroying the family itself." Ethan exhaled quietly beside me. "Thomas knew all of this," he whispered. I folded the letter carefully and stared toward the rain-stained windows overlooking the cliffs. "Not all of it," I answered softly. "Only enough to scare him before he died." Then I noticed something else inside the lockbox beneath the letter. A photograph. Old. Slightly faded around the edges. Victoria standing beside a much younger Isabel, nearly 15 years earlier outside a charity gala in Manhattan, smiling like they had known each other long before David ever met her. The photograph stayed in my mind long after Ethan and I left the study. Victoria looked almost 20 years younger in it, standing beside Isabel beneath the glowing entrance lights of a Manhattan charity gala. Isabel could not have been older than 30 at the time. Elegant even then. Composed. Already wearing that same unreadable smile she used now whenever someone around her became uncomfortable. What unsettled me most was the way Victoria looked at her in the photograph. Not like a stranger. Not even like a friend. She looked proud. By evening, the mansion had settled into its usual rhythm of controlled silence again. James prepared dinner downstairs while Eleanor remained inside the sunroom pretending to read a book she had not turned a page of in over an hour. Ethan sat beside me in the library reviewing old foundation records spread across Thomas's desk. Papers covered nearly every surface now. Transaction ledgers, property transfers, charity reports. The deeper we looked, the clearer the pattern became. Money moved quietly between organizations connected to people loyal to Victoria. Properties changed ownership through shell corporations tied to the foundation board. None of it looked illegal at first glance. That was the frightening part. Whoever designed the structure understood exactly how wealthy families protected themselves. Ethan rubbed both hands across his face and leaned back heavily in the leather chair. David signed almost everything, he said quietly. He probably never even realized what he was approving. I looked toward the dark windows behind him. That is how control works in families like this. Nobody notices it while it is happening. Around 8 o'clock, soft footsteps approached the library hallway. Ethan quickly closed the folders the moment Sophia appeared at the door carrying a slim leather briefcase against her side. She looked younger than most attorneys who handled old money estates, maybe early 30s, with dark hair pulled neatly behind her shoulders and tired eyes that suggested she had already seen too much dishonesty for someone her age. Thomas had hired her shortly before he died, one of the few decisions Victoria openly criticized afterward. Sophia stepped inside carefully and lowered her voice immediately. I should not be here tonight, she said. Victoria believes I am reviewing merger documents downtown. Ethan exchanged a quick glance with me before Sophia opened her briefcase and removed several copied financial statements. Thomas asked me to continue monitoring the foundation accounts if anything happened to him, she explained quietly. I think he suspected someone inside the family was consolidating voting control through charitable trusts. She slid one document toward me. My stomach tightened immediately after reading the names attached to the transfers. Isabel's name still appeared nowhere, but Lily's did. Repeatedly. Ethan stared down at the paperwork in disbelief. Lily, he asked. She barely understands business. Sophia shook her head slowly. Exactly. Which makes her useful. Silence settled across the library after that. Somewhere upstairs a door closed softly. Then another. Harrison Manor always sounded alive at night, as though the walls themselves carried conversations room to room after everyone stopped speaking openly. Sophia lowered her voice even further before saying the one thing none of us wanted to hear. I do not think Isabel is building power for herself alone. The following evening felt colder than the stormy nights before it. Harrison Manor stood unnaturally quiet beneath a sky the color of wet concrete, its tall windows glowing softly against the dark cliffs above the river. Dinner had been scheduled earlier than usual at Victoria's request. That alone told me something important was coming. Families like ours never gathered without a reason. By 7 o'clock, everyone had taken their places around the long oak table again. Isabel sat beside David wearing dark emerald silk that caught the chandelier light every time she moved. Calm as always. Perfect posture. Perfect smile. David looked worse than the night before. Shadows rested beneath his eyes, and he kept rubbing his wedding band absent-mindedly against the tablecloth while staring at nothing. Eleanor remained silent near the center of the table with both hands folded tightly in her lap. Ethan stood near the fireplace this time instead of the staircase, watching Isabel carefully whenever she was not looking at him directly. James poured wine quietly while Victoria discussed foundation business, as though nothing inside the family had begun unraveling. The Manhattan trustees approved the restructuring proposal this afternoon, Victoria said smoothly. Once the final signatures are complete, the estate protections will become permanent. I noticed David stiffen immediately after hearing that. Permanent? He asked quietly. Isabel touched his wrist gently before he could continue. It protects the family assets from outside. Interference, she said. That is all your mother means. Outside interference. Interesting phrase. Sophia entered the dining room almost 10 minutes late, carrying several folders against her chest. Victoria's expression hardened the moment she appeared. I was not informed you would be joining us tonight, Victoria said coolly. Sophia remained composed. Thomas requested I oversee all final trust revisions personally before implementation. The room grew still after that. Ethan slowly moved closer toward the table while James paused beside the fireplace, pretending to adjust a candle. Nobody ate anymore. Sophia placed the folders carefully onto the table and opened one in front of David. There are discrepancies connected to several foundation holdings, she said calmly. Some of the charitable assets have been transferred through intermediary trustees without full board disclosure. David frowned down at the paperwork. I approve these, he said quietly after a moment. Why would there be a problem? Sophia exchanged a brief glance with me before answering. Because the beneficiary structure changed after your signatures were processed. Isabel finally looked unsettled for the first time since entering the family years ago. Barely noticeable, a slight tightening around her eyes. Nothing more. But Ethan saw it too. Who benefits from the new structure? He asked. Sophia slid one final document across the oak table until it stopped directly in front of Victoria. Nobody spoke while she read it. Even the chandelier seemed quieter above us. Then Eleanor suddenly inhaled sharply beside me, her voice trembling when she finally spoke after nearly an hour of silence. You told us this foundation would protect the family, she whispered toward Victoria. Victoria slowly lowered the document onto the tablecloth and looked around the room with frightening calm. It was never about protection, she said softly. It was about control. No one moved after Victoria spoke. The chandelier above the dining table cast long reflections across the polished oak surface while the silence settled over the room like dust finally disturbed after years untouched. David stared at his mother as though he no longer recognized her. Isabel remained perfectly still beside him, but for the first time since she entered Harrison Manor, her composure looked fragile around the edges. Tiny cracks, small enough most people would miss them. Not me, not Ethan. Victoria folded her hands calmly in front of her plate and looked toward David with the same controlled expression she used during foundation meetings and charity galas for decades. Your father built this family on emotion, she said softly. Loyalty, tradition, sentiment. Weak things. Weak people destroy empires. Eleanor lowered her face into her trembling hands beside me. You used us, she whispered. Victoria barely reacted. I stabilized this family. David slowly pushed his chair back from the table. The sound echoed sharply through the dining room. You brought Isabel into my life before we ever met? He asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. Isabel finally looked toward him then, and for a brief moment I almost saw something human pass through her expression. Regret perhaps, or exhaustion. Your mother believed you needed someone who understood how this family worked, she said carefully. David shook his head slowly like a man waking from a long illness. No, he whispered. You made sure I could not function without you. The truth landed differently once spoken aloud. Heavy, permanent. Ethan stepped forward beside the fireplace, no longer hiding at the edges of the room like before. You isolated everyone one by one, he said toward Victoria. Grandma Eleanor stopped speaking. Dad stopped thinking for himself. Harrison became an outsider inside his own home. Victoria's eyes moved toward him calmly. And yet the family survived. No, Eleanor suddenly said, lifting her tear-filled eyes for the first time that night. We only stayed quiet. The room fell still again after that. Somewhere upstairs, the old pipes inside the walls groaned softly beneath the weight of the house. Harrison Manor suddenly felt older than ever before. Tired. Like even the walls wanted rest from carrying generations of controlled silence. Sophia quietly gathered the documents from the table while James extinguished several candles one by one along the dining room walls. Nobody stopped him. Nobody argued anymore. Isabel finally stood slowly from her chair and looked toward Victoria with an expression I could not fully read. Not loyalty, not fear, something emptier. You promised me there would still be a family left after this, she said quietly. Victoria said nothing. That silence answered enough. David walked away from the table first, then Eleanor, then Ethan beside Sophia. One by one they disappeared from the dining room until only Victoria, Isabel, and I remained beneath the chandelier. I looked around the massive old room one last time. The fireplace, the portraits, the endless polished wood. Families like ours believed wealth protected them from collapse. In truth, it only gave people more elegant ways to destroy each other. By dawn the following morning, I was already leaving Harrison Manor behind. Fog rolled across the cliffs overlooking the Hudson River as the mansion faded slowly in the distance through the rear window of the car. Ethan stood alone near the front steps watching me disappear down the long stone driveway. He was the first Harrison in years who looked like he finally understood the difference between loyalty and control.